Of course, America has a very contentious relationship with immigration ever since the beginning of our country. People have very conflicting views on what immigration means to America and what immigration benefits America. It's important to note, though, that in the last presidential election, the biggest issue facing those who voted for the current president weren't jobs, they weren't the economy, they weren't even crime. It was illegal immigration. And of course, that gets conflated with terrorism quite a lot. And polls have consistently shown a dearth of knowledge on immigration in the US by American citizens. Fewer than half know that most immigrants here are here legally. It is a little bit heartwarming, however, to note that most Americans do favor, for instance, legal status for immigrants who came as children and oppose expanding this border wall. It's severely divided by political affiliation, of course. And the majority of polls have shown support for allowing undocumented immigrants to stay in the US. However, when asked where immigrants are having the most negative impact, it is in fact in our schools that people think. There's a lot of misinformation about immigration in the US, for instance, that we are being somehow overrun with immigrants, whereas the immigrants make up only about 13.5% of our population. This is not even the highest it's ever been. When it comes to refugees, however, we've seen a dramatic plummet in the number of refugees that we're taking in. It's one of the lowest in our history since the early 1980s. And even the religious composition of immigrants, people may be surprised to know that the religious composition of the foreign born actually reflects the American religious composition. The majority of them, particularly among unauthorized immigrants, are in fact Christian. And a wealth of research over the decades has shown immigrants are less likely to be criminal, and we can get into the reasons why shortly. Another misconception is that everyone is coming from the south of the border, whereas the majority of immigrants today and projected will be coming from Asia as opposed to Mexico. The number of undocumented workers we've seen in more states are declining than increasing. And this is partly because of a net zero migration of Mexican immigrants over the border. And what do these immigrants do who want to come to America? They come here with the intention of working. So they come in their prime working age, the majority of them, with the intention of working and creating a better future for themselves and their children. And there are more immigrants in this working age category than for the US born. As you can see here in this graph, more than 70% of the foreign born are in their prime working age compared to 50% of the US born. They're located across the spectrum of industries. They tend to be concentrated in the high and low ends of the skills spectrum, but you can find them everywhere from farming and construction to computer and mathematics, life and physical sciences. Healthcare is one particular area where we see a great need for more workers as more baby boomers going into retirement and will need healthcare. They make up just 13.5% of the population, but more than a quarter of physicians and surgeons nationally. And of course, immigrants actually have a high propensity to pay taxes. And even the undocumented immigrants, the majority of them do find a way to pay taxes in order for them to be as much on the straight and narrow as possible. Why do we need immigrants? Because we need more workers to support social systems that today will not look the same way as they would in several years should we not have more workers in our labor force. So whereas there were 16 workers for every person in retirement in 1950, in 2015 there were only 3. And of course, immigrants create jobs. Counter to the prevailing narratives, the act of migrating is itself an entrepreneurial act. And so immigrants are much more likely, 2 times as likely, to start a business. This is not a new phenomenon. We've seen it happen throughout our history. Everything from Budweiser and Levi's Jeans and TJ Maxx to Google and Pfizer and LinkedIn and of course Tesla. So whereas again they make up 13% of the population, just as in the labor force, we see this outsized share of business owners and particularly Main Street owners. And that's a very, very interesting point to note because these are a lot of the very visible businesses we have in our communities. We see them as restaurants and grocery stores. And across the country, we've seen a dramatic increase. In fact, the majority of the growth in Main Street businesses over the past decade have been from foreign immigrant-owned businesses. And this is a really interesting point that I hope you all will remember long after this webinar. Many cities experienced dramatic declines in population after, say, the 1960s. And of those cities that experienced decline, 14 rebounded with an increase in population since 1980. These are those cities. Here are the cities that rebounded without an increase in immigrant population. There are none. Cities needed immigrants, they needed an influx of new people, new talent, new energy in order to revitalize their cities. And looking a little bit at education before I wrap up, we now have the most educated immigrants coming to the US in history. More immigrants are coming in with a bachelor's degree or higher than ever before. As you can see from this graph, postgraduate degrees among immigrants has been dramatically increasing over the years. And it's interesting to note that the second generation of immigrants from many countries, especially Mexico, as you'll see from this graph, their educational attainment compared to that of their parents is incredibly higher. They come to a place where they suddenly have opportunities. By law, they're required to get education and schooling. And as such, they excel and exceed far more than their parents would have in their home countries. Most of the immigrants, of course, are not concentrated in the early education levels. They're in the higher levels. But we all know that we are soon that we're becoming a majority-minority education system when the majority of students will be of color. This projection here is good to note in terms of foreign-born and people of color in our school systems. By 2022, you see a huge increase in especially the Hispanic populations, but also the Asian populations. English proficiency has sort of been leveling out a little bit, but it's important to know that ESL instruction is still one of the largest and fastest growing components of America's adult education system, for instance. And as Hispanics, especially, and foreign-born Hispanic children stay here longer, of course, their English proficiency increases. Some of the factors that allow for immigrant student success that we found in the research was that, for instance, immigrants who come here before their teen years tend to do better in academic achievement. And for instance, Latino children tend to do as well as Asian children, provided they have similar socioeconomic backgrounds. And of course, they tend to be concentrated in those STEM fields. In terms of adults, 1 in 10 working age US adults is considered limited English proficient. And of course, we know that funding for these things have decreased over the years, whereas demand has actually increased. And that demand, that increase in demand shows that contrary to the popular narrative, immigrants want to learn English. So we see here that over the years, more immigrants have been coming with or attaining better education than before. But who are their teachers? There has been an increase in the number of Hispanic teachers in our public school system, but it's still obviously not reflective of the school population.